and thank you for joining today's NeedyMeds special topic webinar, Drug Importation, the topic everyone's talking about, presented by the Partnership for Safe Medicines. My name is Carla. I am the Director of Education and Partnerships at NeedyMeds, and before we get started, I want to go over a few points so you can make the most out of today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Just know we will reserve answering questions until the end. If we don't have the time to answer your question, we will follow up with you personally via email. And of course, I will provide the contact information for both the Partnership for Safe Medicine and NeedyMeds at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the NeedyMeds YouTube channel. And you can find both of our PowerPoint presentation slide decks accompanying today's webinar in the handout section. And if you have trouble downloading them or finding them, just send me a message in that questions section again. So with that, let's get started. For those of you that are not familiar with NeedyMeds, let's talk about who we are. What you are looking at on our screen is all of our fancy wording, our mission statement, our vision statement, and a statement about how we achieve our mission. But simply put, NeedyMeds connects people to programs that will help them afford their healthcare expenses. And we do that free and anonymously through our website, needymeds.org, and our helpline, 1-800-503-6897. What's on your screen now is a screenshot of our homepage, and I like to put that up because really our website is the face of our organization. As you can see, it's full of information, so I encourage you to browse the site when you have more time. For now, I just want to point out a few resources. If you're looking for healthcare savings programs, you'll want to begin your search with the Patient Savings tab. The Advocates tab next to that is where you will find our educational information, where you can sign up for future webinars, our monthly newsletter called Vitals, and order materials and brochures, for example. I mentioned that today's webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to find that recording again on our YouTube channel, and you can find a link to that on the top right of our homepage with the rest of the social media icons. It's the third one from the left. So as you may have seen on our mission statement, a big part of what we do is education. And we define education really in two ways. One, by letting people know about NeedyMeds, but also by keeping them informed about other ways to stay up to date on healthcare topics, which is why we are so pleased to have our guest from the Partnership for Safe Medicines. Let me tell you a little bit about the Partnership for Safe Medicines. They were founded in 2003 and they're a nonprofit focused entirely on researching the danger of counterfeit drugs in America and educating the public about how to stay safe from them. Today's presentation is going to specifically focus on Canadian drug importation. The partnership's executive director, Shabbir Safdar, will talk about the proposals that are out there, how close they are to implementation, what the safety issues involved are, and the effect that this will have on patient behavior. So I took a moment to tell you about the partnership, about what the presentation is going to be. Let me take a brief moment to tell you about our guest, Shabbir. Shabbir has served as the executive director of the Partnership for Safe Medicine since 2017. Before that, he was the director of outreach and served as a consultant to the partnership for nearly a decade. He is passionate about patient safety and the dangers of counterfeits, having seen firsthand the dangers of counterfeits in countries around the world where a closed, secure drug supply chain doesn't exist. He lives in San Francisco with his wife and 2 children, but we're fortunate to have him here with us today. So without further ado, and hopefully seamlessly, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic and the screen to Shabbir. So bear with us while we do that. And in the meantime, as Shabbir is grabbing that screen, I will remind you that if you do have questions again, you can type them into that questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And don't forget, although we encourage you to do that, we will reserve answering questions until the end. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Shabbir. Thanks everybody and enjoy the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Carla, assuming you can hear me and see my screen, I'm going to proceed. Just let me
That's
know if
right. Yes.
awesome. That's
So
great.
I can see your screen, see the screen clearly and hear you clearly. And to our audience members, if you're having difficulty, send me a message in that question section. But from my point of view, we're good to go. Thanks, everybody.
So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time. In this short, roughly 30 minutes, 35 minutes, I'm going to go through what the partnership is, what we do to help bring awareness and help keep the medicine supply in America safe through our partners, and what people are talking about when it comes to Canadian drug importation, because this is an issue that is going to be, it's happening all over the country. People are talking about it, and so you really should have a background in evidence to be able to think about it. We are a coalition of 40 different organizations. They don't all fit on one page, that touch every part of the supply chain, from the manufacturing floor to the wholesale distributors to pharmacists and other healthcare professionals that dispense medication to patient groups. And we include lots of pharmacists, the manufacturers, patient advocates, and folks that do that, like NeedyMeds, who's been a longtime member, who help patients get access to medicine. So we have a lot of perspective, and we've been around since for 17 years. And one of the things that we have done during this time is that we documented the times when counterfeits have made their way to the American public. And this is very important. That old joke that, we are doomed to repeat history unless we remember it. Sometimes we are also doomed to repeat history unless we teach others about the history they've forgotten. And so that is part of our mission, is to remember when Americans have been endangered by counterfeits. And this country has had 4 waves of counterfeits, and we're actually still in the 4th wave right now that have hit the country. The first was when the wholesale market in Florida was poorly regulated, and anyone with $200 in a fax machine could become a pharmaceutical wholesaler. Because of that, and because we didn't at the time have anything like track and trace, what happened was that a lot of people decided to make money by making or putting new, more expensive labels on medicine that either had no active ingredient or had a very weak amount. And we saw a number of individuals get that medicine, because once medicine makes it into the wholesale supply chain in this country, it travels all over the country, much like a much like the coronavirus on an airplane. And so there's 2 different patients. Timothy Fagan, who had a kidney transplant and got counterfeit Epigen, in fact, did live through his experience, although it was incredibly painful. Maxine Blunt, unfortunately, who got counterfeit Procrit as part of her cancer treatment, did not survive. And that's her brother testifying in the Capitol. These medications, when the counterfeiters make them, look so close to the real thing. The only way that you could have told a counterfeit from the real thing, for one of the Amgen products from that era, was the missing degree symbol next to the temperature numbers of where it was supposed to be stored. In other cases, like with this counterfeit product on the right, this Procrit, you'll see there's slightly different fonts on the label and the printing for the lot number and the expiration, and the bottles were slightly different. The caps were a little bit different too, but there's really nothing that even someone who'd handled the medicine a lot might even notice, which was one of the big problems. And this was 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, the counterfeiters were making near perfect copies. Out of that event in Florida, and that spread throughout the nation, we had a long debate as a country for about 8 years about how to secure the medicine supply. And the result was something we now call track and trace. Track and trace, when it's about 3 years from being finished in implementation, is the world's best system for tracking the entire handling of medicine from the factory floor to the pharmacy shelf. What it is a serialized number, and in many cases a barcode, that ends up being added to the medicine on the factory floor and then travels with it. And everybody that handles that medicine is supposed to record or scan that code, so that, first of all, if you have a suspicion about the provenance of something you've been sold, you can check it. But more importantly, you can actually find out exactly where, if you've got counterfeit product or product you have a problem with, where it's been and the individuals who handled it, which makes the investigations a lot faster to conduct, and you can save lives. by finding that counterfeit product and rooting it out as quickly as possible. So that is the system that we have today. And as of last fall, all new medicine that is produced, unless it's grandfathered inventory, is to have these serialized numbers on them. And it makes us we're already one of the most secure medicine supplies in the world, but it makes it even stronger with these additions. Now, technology is not the panacea to medicine safety. It's two parts. It's technology plus a strong regulatory system. And you see this, it's different in America than other countries. And this is why this gets into this topic of importation. Basically, in America, you have the ability to drag in almost anyone into court who is part of the medicine supply chain. And that is a really important factor. When you have an individual who cannot be prosecuted, who does not fear being brought into American court, um, then they have an incentive because of all the money that can be made to do things that would harm patients. And so you see this in the EU, you see this in countries of poor regulation, and wildly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia, where there's no extradition from many countries. There's no extradition from China, actually. So one of the benefits we have is that the companies that employ medicine manufacturers in China are actually here in the U.S. So they heavily work to try and keep their manufacturers on the straight and narrow because they know they can be dragged into court as well. So the second wave of counterfeits we saw in this country came from Canadian entrepreneurs who thought that the price differences on patented medication between Canada and America would be something that would be advantageous to take advantage of. And there's two of them that were the first entrepreneurs and the most well-known, Chris Thorkelson and Andrew Strempler. Chris Thorkelson started Canada Drugs, Andrew Strempler started RX North. And what happened is, because Canada's drug supply is not made in Canada, and their population is about 1/9 of America's, very, very quickly, this is one of the other entrepreneurs, all of the Canadian online pharmacies had to move to buying product from overseas and selling it as Canadian to Americans. And what happened was, once one of these web vendors went to this solution, they all had to follow, because the amount of money that you can make when you're not just buying price controlled Canadian product, but rogue manufactured product that's been made in the third world, but has Canadian labels. Once you actually have that profit, you can out advertise your competition. And so this gentleman, who eventually exited the business, did an interview with a Canadian broadcasting company where he talked about this problem, and that he simply couldn't stay in the business and compete with them. We saw a number of these vendors actually work with states during this time, where states like Illinois would cut a deal with a Canadian vendor, and the Canadian vendor would fill prescriptions for people in that state. And the Illinois program, which was done under Rod Blagojevich, who became famous for other reasons, was one of the most famous. It didn't do a lot of prescriptions because, as with all these programs, as generics came along, they dropped the price of medicine, and much more effectively than any importation program could. But they found that they had a limited amount of control and inability to regulate these foreign entities. They couldn't complete their inspections because they needed permission to enter the Canadian warehouses. And it was a very expensive program. Imagine if you're the state of Illinois, but you're trying to send inspectors to Canada to inspect warehouses there. Just travel alone becomes very, very expensive very, very quickly. And it was a real problem. When the program shut down, again, it shuts down because there's not a great uptake, because generics bring down the price of medicine as the time goes by, and Medicare Part D coverage does as well. You end up with the program just shuttering because it was bleeding more money in state budget than it was saving anyone. Minnesota did one of these programs as well, and they had this really terrible inspection where they went to Canada and they inspected a warehouse. And if the warehouse had been in Minnesota, it would have been shut down. The pharmacy would have been lost its license and had it suspended within the day. But they found things like refrigerated required products being shipped without refrigeration. They had no historic thermometers in refrigerators that could tell you, if it had ever gotten warm. And they had just lots of failures that they had no ability to force the Canadian vendors to fix. And that's the real problem when I talk about regulation. In 2013, Maine actually tried importation as well. And what they did was they basically just deregulated it. So no inspections, no safety budget, nothing, no licenses. They just said go have at it. And a professor of pharmacy at the University of New England ordered some medications from a company called Canada Drug Center, which he saw advertising in the Portland Press Herald in Portland, Maine. And he tested them in his lab and found that they didn't have sufficient active pharmaceutical ingredient. And that's very dangerous because, if you get something that's a quarter dose and you're not responding to medication, your physician may up your dose to something higher. And if you then go into a CVS instead of going to one of those Canadian vendors and get that medicine, it's now full strength and you could have a real terrible medical adverse event. So these are scenarios that are not imaginary. These things have actually happened. And so these medications were shown by lab tests to be insufficient. One of them had a contaminant in it, and both the Attorney General and the Maine Board of Pharmacy, of course, don't possess any extradition permissions. They have no treaty with Canada, so even though they knew the names of the perpetrators in Canada, they were not able to force them to come to court in America. And they, in fact, never did come to court in America. They sent their lawyers, and eventually the Department of Justice negotiated a plea deal, but no one ever went to jail for this. That was the second wave of counterfeits. The third wave was really particularly bad. The third wave was when many of the Canadian vendors and others figured out that there was a lot more money to be made selling wholesale lots of oncology and other expensive injectables directly to physicians who administer them in office. So independent oncologists who do cancer treatment in their office and have infusion chairs and nursing staff and so forth, they were their targets. And the 4 or 5 criminal rings that operated during this period targeted those individuals and had an enormous footprint across this country. Touching every single state and many, many different therapeutic areas. We don't talk about it too much, but there's actually for a while a large swath of black market IUDs that also came through during this time, and many of them made in non-sterile conditions, which had consequences for their patients. One of the folks that broke the supply chain during this time was this Dr. Norbergs. And she not only bought these products from wholesalers that had sales offices in Montana and Tennessee to try and make them seem legitimate, but she ended up giving them to 66 of her patients. And there was at least one patient who died under her care whose family is very concerned because they don't really know. There's no way to prove what medicine their mom got. The records say that she got medicine that Dr. Norbergs bought from one of the Canadian vendors, but there's no way to prove that she would have lived through her cancer had she gotten the real medicine because there's no, Wanda Colgan's not around anymore to actually ask her. She passed away under treatment. So her family is pretty angry, and they spoke at outside the courthouse at Dr. Norberg's sentencing. This is a map that my staff has done of all the medical clinics that were caught by the FDA during this time doing business with these unlicensed wholesalers, some in Canada, some elsewhere. And it really touches the whole country. It's quite scary. Another victim during this time was Betty Hunter. She was treated with this counterfeit Avastin, which in Turkey is named Altuzan. And that's a picture of the counterfeit product. And she had late-stage lung cancer, and she had basically had one chance at treatment and buying some extra time for her to spend with her family, and she lost that because she was given counterfeit medication. It had no active ingredient. That bottle contains just saline, which is water, and some mold because it was made in a non-sterile environment. And so that was made in Turkey and then sold into America as the same as Avastin. It obviously is not. So one of the big things we learned from that period that is one of the things that gives us pause as we evaluate importation programs is the difficulty of prosecuting foreign actors. We actually have an extradition treaty with Canada that covers counterfeits, but it turns out that actually having an extradition treaty is not enough. So in 2014, the Canada Drugs executives were indicted by the Department of Justice, and they basically said, look, we have proof. 5 of you were involved. You sold $78 million of fake cancer and other drugs that were not approved. And interestingly enough, they did it with a Canadian wholesale license. So they actually had a license, a wholesaler's license from Health Canada, but they were still, which they were able to get, but they still did this anyway. And the Americans said, please come to court to face the charges, and the Canadians said, no, thank you. And negotiations went on for 3 years, after which finally the Department of Justice set an extradition hearing, and the Canadians said, we're going to win that case. We're not going to come to America. Maybe you want to cut a deal with us and talk through what we might do. And so the Department of Justice gave up, and the penalty they did was they dropped the other 4 individuals from the indictment. So they walked away. The founder of the company was forced to shut down all of his companies in this space. Not before they sold off most of their inventory, though. He was given a $250,000 fine and given 6 months house arrest, which I guess he used to catch up on Netflix, and 4.5 years of supervised probation. And no one in this company was required to serve any jail time. No one was required to surrender their pharmacy license. And no one had to actually enter a guilty plea of selling counterfeit drugs. In fact, for over a year and a half after this judgment, Mr. Thorkelson still possessed a pharmacist license in the province of Manitoba, a fact that is appalling, should be appalling to all of us. That was the third wave of counterfeits. And the wave that we're in right now started with fentanyl. These 3 bottles show fatal doses of heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil. And if you're wondering where is the carfentanil, it's that single speck, that single salt grain on the right. Carfentanil is a veterinary tranquilizer used in large game, and it is extremely powerful. And what we saw starting in about 2015 was that people who wanted to go into business for themselves, making their own pills, both in America and elsewhere, were buying pill presses and these pill molds. You can see a Xanax pill mold there on the right. That is illegal to own, but the penalty is not high enough to deter people who can make tons and tons of money. And people started making counterfeit pills and counterfeit Xanax and counterfeit opioids made with fentanyl. Fentanyl isn't of itself an opioid. It is a medically useful product. And so you started to see these pills circulate. And one of the problems of counterfeit product is that it doesn't stay with the person who bought it. And so we have story after story that the partnership has documented where individuals like Tosh Ackerman took a Xanax from a friend because they couldn't or didn't think that they could get to a doctor on the weekend when they were having a very stressful time. And if it has fentanyl and it has a little bit too much fentanyl, it can kill you. And you saw how small an amount of fentanyl is fatal. So imagine trying to get that dosage right when you're making pills in your garage. This is an actual photo that Carrie Luther, Tosh's mom, gave us from the coroner's office of the pill that they found next to the bed that Tosh took. He didn't even take the whole pill. The quality control on this fake pill was so bad that he took just about a quarter of it, and that was enough to kill him. These pills, since the partnership has been tracking them, have spread throughout the country, and the spread has been so fast that even this map is out of date. We are now at fake pills in 49 states. It's everywhere except for Hawaii, and we've got deaths in 39, including Prince, by the way. Prince died from a fake pill, a fake opioid made with too much fentanyl. This wave, though, is not over, and it's not just fentanyl. We're now seeing counterfeit Adderall made with methamphetamine. It's shown up in 3 states so far. And of course, these pills look exactly like the real thing. But the more disturbing part about this is that if you know anyone between the ages of 16 and 24, you know that they actually use Adderall as a study aid, which is a problem, even if you don't actually have a prescription for it. And more importantly, they actually are very not careful about where they get their Adderall. So they routinely swap it between each other. Kids with prescriptions will lend or sell out, pills from their prescription to others. And that kind of sharing means that they're not all getting their medicine from a pharmacist, and they're likely at some point to be taking one of these products that's a counterfeit because they're not using the secure supply chain. And that's a real disturbing health development. I think it's a public health problem we're going to see even more of as these spread around the country. So that was a lot of really scary stuff. So let's just take a moment and appreciate the puppies and take a big breather. And let's talk about some policy. How does this happen today? How does this impact the debate about importation, which is really what I started this conversation to talk about? We are in a phase right now where the White House has suggested that we do drug importation. Now, that importation would happen based upon a 2003 law called the Medicare Modernization Act. And it's not a free-for-all. The two pathways are either pathway 2, where a manufacturer who's made something, let's say for the Canadian market, willingly rebrands it for the American market at a lower price to avoid some contractual obligations they may have with a pharmacy benefit manager. And that's not really what people are talking about when they talk about importation. What they're really talking about is a state contracting with a Canadian vendor to import medication that was made for the Canadian market without the permission of the manufacturer or anybody else. And there's some restrictions. It has to be a pharmacist or a wholesaler that has the contract with the Canadian, and it's only certain types of drugs. And one of the big categories of drugs that's not allowed is biologics, of which includes insulin. So if you heard people talk about importing medicine to solve issues around the cost of insulin, these programs are not going to address that. And so you'll hear me say this often, which is that this is not a solution that can really make any difference to most Americans. And it's definitely not going to make any difference to diabetics who are struggling with the cost of insulin because it's not allowed under this program. One of the big problems that you see when you just look at the basic math of importation is that Canada does not make its own medicine. And that's a real issue because they have no way to actually ramp up, and the population difference is quite stark between America and Canada. Canada's got about 37 million people, 38 million people. America's got 327 or more million people, and the population difference means that we would strip their supply dry in about 6 to 9 months if we were to shift even 20% of our prescription drug demand to the Canadian supply. The Canadians know this, and they're a little panicked because they are already having shortages of really key drugs. So tamoxifen is a medicine that you are on if you have or you are recovering from breast cancer. They're actually having shortages of it in Canada right now. They don't make it in Canada, so they are in no position to either make up their own shortage or to supply America if someone in America decides that they would like to buy it cheaper in Canada. And to this end, the Canadian government has been pretty clear about saying that they're not on board with this. And they actually made a special trip to the White House last October to deliver a very pointed message to the White House that they were not going to be a willing partner in the White House's proposal to import medication from Canada, despite the president's enthusiasm about that. Another aspect of this, which is problematic, is because of all of the problems that law enforcement has seen over the last 4 years, looking at the counterfeit medicine crisis, especially in the area of opioids. 3 major law enforcement organizations have come out against drug importation, 2 sheriff's groups and 1 chiefs of police group. They're very, very clear that they just don't think that this is a safe method. So let's talk about what we can do, right? Because you never tell someone not to do something. You always want to have solutions, and there are a lot of solutions out there. You all know this because you work with NeedyMeds and you're advocates for patients, but over and over again, as we've seen people try and experiment with importation over the years, what we've seen is that those programs have difficulty saving enough money to justify their costs. And while they're happening, as drugs roll off of patent and generics come out, they end up being cheaper, that's what actually drives the price down, the generic market. And so there's actually a number of medicines that are generic in the top 50. In fact, most of them that are cheaper here than in Canada, because the market in America, of course, is big. We have more people, and so there's more manufacturers that make generics. And so this is actually a measurable effect. The FDA actually did an analysis of generic competition on drug prices, and when you get to about 3 different generic manufacturers in a market, as this line over the 3 shows, you see the price go down to about 30 to 40% of the original. And when you get 7 or 8 into a market, it's down below 1/10 of the original. So the answer clearly that is actually both working and effective and under our control with no safety issues is to increase the amount of generics in the market. And so you'll always see one of the things the partnership advocates is that the FDA get more resources to be able to review applications from generic manufacturers faster, because the faster we get those products on the market, including generic biologics, which are called biosimilars, the better consumers are going to have price relief. And this is already a driver of healthcare prescription cost control. About 17% of the healthcare dollar in America is prescription drugs. And so the bulk of that is, hospital and so forth. And in 2018, 90% of all prescriptions were filled with generics. So and the number is increasing since the previous 2-year span. So this is actually a really great driver of cost savings in America, and the goal is, I think, to keep driving that higher. Others, obviously, I don't have to tell you about the NeedyMeds discount card because you all know it, but discount cards are a great way to work with patients to help address costs, and prescription assistance programs. I think the PPARCS program is probably called something else now, but the URL still works, I think. And finally, the issues around this are very serious. We are actually looking at right now, HHS has got draft regulations that they have published that address bringing in medicine from Canada. And one of the biggest concerns that we have in looking at those is that they do not allow track and trace. So that track and trace system that was enacted after the awful counterfeit disasters in Florida in the early 2000s, there's no track and trace system in Canada. There's no way to plug into anything there. They don't actually even keep paper records that travel along with the lots of medicine. So the White House is proposing that we basically undermine the track and trace system so we can buy cheap medicine from Canada. And it's never, in our opinion, it's never a good idea to sacrifice safety for costs, because it just puts people in danger. So we are asking everyone to go to this website, to go to this web address, which is on our website, and join the American Pharmacists Association and the health system pharmacists and the boards of pharmacy, and all tell the White House that these regulations are not good enough, that we cannot solve this problem by basically stealing all of Canada's medication. There's not enough of it. And with 1/9 the population, 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 9 Americans will never see any benefit, and they will eventually run out and stop selling to us. So before March 9th, if you can, actually go to this web address and just file a sentence or two saying, I've looked at these issues and I feel like this is not the safe or sustainable way to address this problem. That would be very, very helpful. And with that, Carla, that is the end of my formal presentation. I would be happy to take questions now.
Fantastic. Shabbir, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to share your expertise about this important topic with the NeedyMeds audience. And it really is eye-opening. And I hope everybody does take Shabbir up on his encouragement to voice your opinion, but I would also recommend that you familiarize yourself even further with the Partnership for Safe Medicines. Check out their website because it's a great opportunity to even educate yourself further. I am going to take a minute and remind everybody, I do see some questions coming in, but I will remind everybody that if you do have questions, you can go ahead and type them into that question section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And before we get to those, I just also want to take a moment to remind everybody one of the things that Shabbir importantly pointed out, and I'm not referring only, of course, to a very important slide, which was obviously the puppy slide. That was pretty important. Um, but in addition to that, Shabbir also took the time to talk about what can we all do. And one of the things was trying to simply save money on medications. So I do hope everybody remembers that NeedyMeds is a source of support to help you do that. What you're looking at on the screen now are some of our most popular and effective ways to save on your healthcare expenses. And when I say healthcare expenses, of course, I'm talking about medications, be it name brand or generic, but I'm also talking about other healthcare expenses. So please take the time to visit that patient savings tab on our website that I had the opportunity to mention at the beginning of the presentation. And don't hesitate to reach out to our expert call center counselors. We also have Spanish speaking counselors. And since we do have a captive audience and you're all waiting to Shabbir to answer the questions that you typed in, I want to remind everybody that we do our best to populate our calendar of events with webinars we do think you'll be interested in. We've got a couple coming up in the beginning of next month specifically about NeedyMeds, the help affording healthcare costs. We'll talk to you about NeedyMeds, the resources we offer, and how to find what you need on our website. And the week after that, we do have about a 15-minute presentation specifically on prescription assistance programs. So we do hope you join us with those. And you can sign up for those on the bottom right hand of our homepage. You'll see the calendar events. So please do check that out. As we get to those questions, I wanted to leave the contact information screen up. And of course, as I said, we encourage you to visit the Partnership for Safe Medicine's website. And I also want to stress what Shabbir said, which is we really encourage you to comment, to leave your comments at the website on federal proposals to import medicine from Canada. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that screen up, but a reminder, if you want to take a look at anything Shabbir has covered today, you can access his PowerPoint in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. So with that, let's get to some of the questions coming in. The first one is, what other stakeholders in Canada have weighed in on America's plan to import their medicines?
So this is actually one of the most sobering things about this debate is that there is near universal opposition to this proposal in Canada. They have about over 2,000 drugs in shortage in Canada, and they only have 13,000 approved medicines in their inventory. So that's a lot. And so there have been joint letters sent to the federal government from the entire swath, the manufacturers, the Pharmacists Association, the Medical Association, which is all the doctors, the Nurses Association, and many, many patient advocacy groups, including the Canadian Diabetes Association and others, all begging Prime Minister Trudeau and the federal government to step in to block any export of pharmaceuticals in bulk from Canada to America. So it's been pretty broad, and they're pretty panicked, and they're really quite torn, I think, because they don't really want to upset their relationship with the U.S., and they're certainly, afraid of retaliation from this administration, but at the same time, they know they have to do something because it would not take a lot for America to have a real terrible impact on the medicine supply in Canada. We're just so large.
Thank you for the thorough answer, and of course to our audience member for giving you the opportunity to shed some light on that. Another question coming in from an audience member is, does the Partnership for Safe Medicines have any information on how counterfeits are affecting the safety of Canadian citizens, and are they at risk to the same extent?
So they are at risk. They do have a little bit more of a universal healthcare system than we do. It actually, believe it or not, doesn't cover prescription drugs, but there are price controls on prescription drugs in Canada, and that has reduced the amount of counterfeit demand there. But they actually are having the same fentanyl counterfeit problem we are having there, where people are making fake drugs made with made with fentanyl, fake opioids, and fake Xanax, and it's particularly bad among the indigenous peoples of Canada. They also have a steady supply, and this is partly driven by shortages of people who are ordering medicines from foreign web pharmacies. They don't have fake Canadian web pharmacies in Canada. They have real pharmacies, but they still order from places that appear to be in Europe but are actually the Caribbean, because people are trying to get access to medicines that are either in shortage or are unaffordable to them. And and the Border Patrol of Canada does intercept these packages when they do spot checks from time to time and find these counterfeits coming into the country. So yeah, they have a problem. It's not as bad as ours, but they definitely have a problem.
And another question coming in, and I think this is another good one as well, is can't Canada just make up more of their own medicine to account for U.S. demand?
So if they actually had manufacturers in Canada that made medicine, they could, but they don't. Manufacturing, neither the companies that own the intellectual property nor the company that actually has the factory floors and to make medicine are in Canada. They have one or two sizable generic manufacturers in the country, but none of the branded medicines, none of the biologics, none of those are really made in Canada. They buy them from elsewhere. And the problem for the Canadians is that they get an allocation that's sized to their population. They can't just order any infinite amount. So they can neither make additional medicine to sell to America, nor can they buy it from the manufacturer, because they don't control those companies.
That's an important that's a very important part of the problem that I'm glad we have the audience member gave you an opportunity to shed some light on. I have another question coming in from an audience member, and it looks more like this is a question geared towards NeedyMeds, and it brings up a good point. So I'm going to go ahead and share it with everyone. For patients that need brand name medications the same day or pretty soon, and they're very costly, sometimes you can get the medication at a more affordable price through a prescription assistance program, that it doesn't necessarily resolve getting that medication immediately. So what do you recommend to do when a patient needs help ASAP for expensive meds? And that's I'm so glad you asked that, because it does give me an opportunity to showcase some of our resources and maybe debunk some myths about how long it does take. If you are looking for help affording a brand name medication, the very first part of our website you're going to want to check out is the Prescription Assistance Program section, which will pop up right under the Patient Savings tab on the top left side. The reason I say that is because by far, prescription assistance programs will offer the most savings for brand name medications. They usually provide them for, let me say this, they often provide them for free or for a very small fee. One thing I do want to say is, as our audience member said, sometimes prescription assistance program applications can be a bit of a process, not only applying and hopefully getting accepted, but it takes a little bit of time sometimes to get that medication. But what I want to point out is that the turnaround time for prescription assistance programs does vary, and sometimes it can vary greatly from program to program. What's really helpful about the NeedyMeds website is once you find a medication on our website that does offer a prescription assistance program, we have different sections on that program page that will tell you all the information you need to know about that program. It'll list clearly the eligibility requirements, but it'll also list other details, such as how long does the application process take and how long can you get a decision by that program as to whether or not you're eligible. And then where can you get that medication? Will it be mailed to your home or to the doctor's office? The reason I'm stressing this is sometimes it can take a little bit of time, but sometimes on the application it said you will find that answer that same day. So sometimes the process isn't as long as you may think it is. However, if you don't have the luxury of waiting, certainly I say apply anyway. In the meantime, you can see if there is a coupon available for that medication. And then, of course, as a safety net, you can always use the NeedyMeds drug discount card. You can print one out online. You can download an app for it for free onto your phone. We can mail you one, and we can also let you know where the drug discount card is accepted in your area and how much that medication is going to cost you before you head out the door. So please don't hesitate to still check out those prescription assistance programs, but check out the coupons and the drug discount card as well. And also, I want to stress, please reach out to our call center counselors at that number on the bottom of your screen at 1-800-503-6897. They are here to help. And again, we do have Spanish-speaking counselors. Just don't forget, we're on the East Coast. We're in Massachusetts. So we're open 9 to 5 Monday through Friday on the East Coast. But thank you for that question. Another question coming in, Shabbir, is, has anyone done a financial analysis of drug importation?
So yeah, actually, that's a really good question. One of the problems is that because you can't import biologics, and biologics are typically the cost drivers for many patients. It's not, Lipitor, because Lipitor has 11 generics on the market, but these biologics, because they're so hard to make, are actually quite expensive. I mean, you have to grow a protein in a lab and in a pure way. And so what happens is that because you can't import biologics, these programs are challenged to save money in the first place. They have some difficulty saving money. A doctor in Colorado, a doctor of economics, Dr. Christina Ackery, did the math on actually testing, right? Because one of the requirements is that if you import medicine from Canada, you have to do finished product testing. And the finished product testing, not surprisingly, outweighs whatever savings you might have gotten from buying the drugs from Canada at a cheaper price. People who study importation programs know this. Some of the states that are proposing to do it have been in denial that this will be a problem, but they're going to discover it pretty fast as soon as they actually have to put their program together and institute some testing regimen.
Thank you, Shabbir. And a big thank you to our audience for taking time out of their day to join us for today's NeedyMeds special topic webinar, again, presented by the Partnership for Safe Medicines. We do try and keep the question segment of our presentations brief. So if you did ask a question and we didn't have the opportunity to answer, please know we will follow up with you via email, but you can always visit safemedicines.org, NeedyMeds.org, or reach out to the NeedyMeds call center at 1-800-503-6897. I also want to thank Shabbir again for taking time out of his day to share his expertise with the NeedyMeds audience. We do deeply appreciate our partnership with the Partnership for Safe Medicines. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.